Burlington Historical Trail was established by the Garden Club in 1976. There are 12 sites, and we will be traveling and identifying and learning about them, as well as some specific historic houses within our own town. This vicinity was probably first visited by white men as early as 1621. Charlestown was settled in 1629, and the Great and General Court, organized by the 10 towns in existence in 1634, granted to Charlestown a wide expanse of territory lying north of it. Within this area were destined to be the towns of Woburn, Burlington, and Winchester. The land here was explored by a small surveying party in 1635 and later in 1640. This latter group established the bounds of a new village called Charlestown Village. 2 years later, in 1642, this village became the town of Woburn. Also in 1642, Native American tribes were here. We know there was an Indian reservation where Chestnut Hill Cemetery is now. Numerous relics, arrowheads, and spears have been found and are on display in our museum in Burlington. Burlington, as a geographical entity, was not established until 1730, when this area became Woburn's second parish. The Church of Christ Congregational was built for this parish in 1732 and is still standing at the top of Lexington Street. This was the meeting house for the second parish. It was the social center of the community as well as the spiritual center of the parish. Woburn worried that the second parish meeting house might foreshadow a split into another town, and it did. In 1799, Burlington was incorporated as a town. The Reed House. The Reed House is located on 23 Chestnut Street. It was a farm handed down from generation to generation from John Reed. He had bought land from a gentleman, Henry Baldwin, in 1700. John was born in 1660. Isaiah was born in 1795. Isaiah Reed attended Old North School and Warren Academy in Woburn. He is the one that built the first smokehouse, which was 20 feet by 20 feet, where he cured his hams. This house, unfortunately, in the 20th century had a house fire. It was rebuilt, but when it was rebuilt with no chimney, no fireplaces, nothing that would possibly cause another fire in the house. There is still a barn at the back. The North School was on the corner of Wilmington Road and still is on the corner of Wilmington Road and Chestnut Street. It was one of the 4 schoolhouses that was mandated to be built in the late 1700s, 1792 to 1794. It is where Isaiah went to school, which was right practically next to his house. He came into possession of the Reed farmhouse around 1830s. He had bought a few hogs and sold the pork and sausage in town. He also cured a few hams and gave them away as gifts to family and friends. They were such a big hit that people asked him to cure their own pigs and hogs. He had an excellent recipe for curing the hams, and he also knew where the best hickory wood was for the smoking. In 1868, he began to buy his own hams. That year he sold 100 hams. By 1872, he was curing between 4,000 to 5,000 a season. When Isaiah died in 1874, his son Thomas took over the business. There were 3 large smokehouses and a huge vault that held thousands of pounds of meat. From 1889 to 1890, 8,000 hams were sold. There were also many men in the area that were employed in the business. He became a very prominent citizen of Burlington. He built his house right near the ham works, and he was one of the first to have electricity in his house. He not only had it in his house, but he had his own electrical plant so that he could also have electricity for the houses of his children. When he passed, his sons, Guy Jr., son Harold, took over. It was the most well-known and successful Burlington business. Sadly, its smokehouses were closed in 1953. The next one I'd like to talk about is the Francis Wyman House. In 1640, both Francis and John came from England. Francis was 21. John was his younger brother, who was 19. They were both two of the original signers of the town charter of Woburn. They were tanners in Woburn. In 1655, they bought 500 acres from the Harvard president and paid $100. 10 years later, in 1665, they bought another 500 acres. This time, it was $50, and they bought it from the Woburn Countmeyer Grant. They built two houses then, about a half a mile apart. During this time, there was also the King Philip's War. Both Francis Sr. and his son, Francis Jr., and John and his son, John Jr., were in the King Philip's War. Francis Jr. was unfortunately killed during the war, and John Jr. had wounds that eventually killed him as well. The house is a garrison. It's believed to have been the fort in the area in case of any Indian uprisings or Indian problems. Within the house, there is a hidden stairway that goes down to the basement. Also, on the second floor, there was a hideaway for the children. There was a panel there that could be taken down, and it was right near the chimney, and the children would be put in there near the chimney bricks and the panel replaced, and they were told to be extremely quiet in case there was a problem with the Native Americans. About 1820, they decided to sell. Matthew Skelton bought it and owned it until 1827. In 1827, Joshua Reed bought it. In 1899, it was not looking very well. A lot of the Wyman family happened to go by it and noticed that it looked in very difficult shape, and they decided to form an association, and they had the Francis Wyman Association, and they bought the house and restored it, and today it looks absolutely beautiful. It had been painted red, but unfortunately there was a fire in the house in 1997, and when it was restored, they realized that the house should be a gold paint color, that was more appropriate for the time period. So it was originally believed to have been built in 1660, extended and renewed more about 1730, and then after the fire, a lot of it has been restored and renewed, but there still are some areas that show the evidence of the fire there. The next building that I would like to talk about is the West School. The West School was originally built on top of Simon's Park Hill, where the baseball field is located now. What had happened was Woburn was told that they needed to build 4 one-room schoolhouses because of all the children within the town. The schoolhouses they built were the north, south, east, and west. The north school was built on the corner of Chestnut and Wilmington Street. The east school was built on Mountain Road. The west school was built on Simon's Park Hill. About 1830s, they realized there were not quite as many children from that center area. Instead of building a brand new school to put there, or to have built there, they decided to move what was called the center school, which we now call the West School, and move it down to the corner of Francis Wyman Road and Bedford Street, where it is located now. The South School was built at the corner of Lexington Street and Blanchard. So that was 1839. I wanted to mention about the fact that in those days, most of the time, the teachers were male, especially in the 1700s and the early 1800s. As time went on, a little more into the 1800s, there became more female teachers. Now, what ended up happening was the male teachers were paid more than the female teachers, even though the workload for both was exactly the same. Also, the female teachers, if they became married, immediately lost their job. The male teachers could be married and have children and still have their job. The Historical Museum, or the Center School, was built in 1855. And it was for students that were over 12 years of age. Each student that went to the school was called a scholar. The scholars were eventually put into groups, this time by ability, not by age, which originally had been done. The school hours were 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., and then lunch, and then 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. The building itself was only used until 1896, and then it was closed because it was believed to have been too small. After it had been closed, it was used as a library, and a gentleman named Edward Barker, who we've mentioned before, was wonderful. He had bought all kinds of materials for the library, all kinds of books and different things that a library would need. Abner Marion had originally owned it. He donated it to the town. Later on, after it had been a library for a while, it then became a police station. And finally, today, it is now the home of the Burlington Historical Commission. In the late 1800s, the state decided they wanted to consolidate more school children together. And so Burlington did that as well. They decided to take all the children from the 4 schoolhouses and bring them to a new school called the Union School. Next is the Kent House. The Kent House is located on Middlesex Turnpike. The Kent House was built by a gentleman named John Kent. He was a brewer from Charlestown. The house, when you see it, is built of fieldstone, and this fieldstone was gathered locally from the farm itself. John and his daughter lived there in the house for many years. Now, they do have a slight story here about the fact that the walls in this house, because of all the stone, were very thick, and they used to crack occasionally, and sometimes when they cracked, it almost sounded like there was an animal within the house. So sometimes they thought of that as very mysterious. In the 1920s, a Burns family moved into the Kent House, and they added a wing, and they built a tennis court. Their son, John McGregor Burns, taught at Williams College, and he wrote a number of books about politics and government. So he was a very famous gentleman who had been brought up in what we call the Kent House, but his name, the Mackenzie family and the Connor family, also owned the house. Later, when businesses bought the land around there, the businesses then owned the Kent House. For example, when RCA was in that area, they owned the house. When Sun Micro was in the area, Sun Micro also owned it. Right now, we want to talk about the former site of the Jonathan Simons House. Unfortunately, this house has been demolished. It was built about 1780. They believe it was initially built by Ishmael Monroe about 1821. The farm had 93 acres. Jonathan, who the home is named after, marched off to Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. He was one of the Minutemen. He was a member of the Captain Joshua Walker militia. He was married and later became a deacon of the Church of Christ Congregational until 1827 when he passed away. His son, Jonathan Jr., was born 1782. He got the house and married Betsy, who was Ishmael Monroe's daughter. He helped to save the original Church of Christ building. He objected to tearing it down. His son Otis was sold the farm from the family, and it has gone through many hands. One of the owners was Margaret Milliken, who bought the home in 1914. Her son, Leonard, joined the Army in World War I in 1917, and he was one of the 2 Burlington gentlemen who were killed in action. The Legion, American Legion, is named after him and the other gentleman as well. They were both killed in World War I. I am now going to talk about the Jotham Johnson House. It was a beautiful example of 18th century Georgian colonial structure, and the pediment at the front of the house is beautifully detailed. Jotham Johnson built it in 1732, actually the same year that they built the church. He built it 2 years after Benjamin Johnson built the Sewall House. 3 generations of Jotham Johnson lived in Burlington in the 18th century, so it can become very confusing. The last Johnson to operate this farm was also Jotham Johnson. He was born in 1778. It has been owned by many hands ever since. In 1846, a family called the Crosbys owned it, and later sold in 1851 to Ward Brooke Frothingham, who bought it. In 1900, the owner was Edward Barker, and then it went to Carl Hall, and Kenneth Dobbins was later. The Rice House. The Rice House is a Greek revival and Italian style. It was built in 1845 to 1850. In 1867, Captain Joshua Frost Rice bought the house because he wanted to retire to a rural setting. It has 15 rooms, and at that time there were 112 acres to the farm. In 1891, Lotta Rice Dunham was born there. Her family had owned it. She also wrote a wonderful history about the town of Burlington. It is one of Burlington's most impressive 19th century mansions. It is located on the corner of South Bedford Street and Lexington Street. The Sewall House. The Sewall House is located off of Lexington Street. It was originally built by Benjamin Johnson in 1730. Samuel Sewall was born there in this old house and lived there. The house was purchased by Reverend Thomas Jones later in 1751. He was one of the reverends from the Church of Christ Congregational. After he passed away, there was a Reverend John Merritt, and his daughter was married to the next Reverend Sam Sewall, married Mr. Merritt's daughter. There were 6 generations of pastors that lived there. Unfortunately, in 1897, there was a fire, and the original house was destroyed. It was rebuilt, and sadly, that house also caught fire. The Sewall House is the house that is on the Burlington seal. And there is a memorial there on Lexington Street. It stands there, and it's right near where the house had been built. And so you could read the memorial. A little bit more of the history is on that memorial that stands there. This church was the United Church of Christ, and it was built in 1732 because the people in that area of Burlington, well, it was Wyman at the time, found it extremely difficult to get to their church in the center of Wyman, especially in the wintertime. There was so much mud, so much snow, that they finally asked if they could possibly have their own church there in what they called the second parish. Eventually, it was built in 1732, which was wonderful. The people were quite happy it was there. Benjamin Johnson was the gentleman who had given them the land to put the church on the corner of Lexington Street and Bedford. And the first minister was Supply Clapp. In 1751, Reverend Thomas Jones became the pastor there. And he was the pastor there for 23 years. After Mr. Jones passed away, from 1751 to 1774, Reverend John Merritt became the pastor, and he was the pastor for 39 years, from 1774 to 1813. Now, what had ended up happening was Reverend Thomas Jones had a lovely daughter, and Reverend John Merritt, when he became the pastor, married the daughter of Reverend Thomas Jones. He married Martha Jones. After John Merritt decided to leave after he'd been there 39 years, a Reverend Samuel Sewall took over. He took over from 1814 to 1842, which was 28 years. Now, what had happened in this section was the Reverend John Merritt, who had married Martha Jones, they had a daughter, Martha, as well. And when Reverend Samuel Sewall came and became pastor, he married Martha Merritt, who was the daughter of Reverend John Merritt, the pastor before him. The church has been the center of both spiritual and social functions. Lots of meetings were held there. Across from the church is the old burial ground. It was 1 acre, a parcel. Now, what ended up happening was the church was built in 1732. Obviously, people began to pass away, and they started interring the people across the street from the church. Several people had been, but the land that they were burying these people on had not been given to the church. It was owned by the same gentleman that had donated the land for the church, but he had not deeded that land to them as a graveyard. After several years, he decided that it might be a wise idea to donate the land for the graveyard, and that's what he did do. He did deed the old burial grounds to the church. The oldest stone at the graveyard is from 1736, and it was from a gentleman, Obadiah Johnson, who was in his 90s. Also buried in that graveyard were 22 Revolutionary soldiers, and also there were soldiers from the War of 1812 as well. By the 1850s, The graveyard was almost full, and they decided no more people would be able to be buried there. There was one exception. In 1874, James Walker, who had been brought up in the Walker House right at the center of town, who had gone to Harvard, who had been a president of Harvard, he passed away, and his family had already purchased graves at the graveyard. He was allowed to be buried in the plot there. He was the last person to be buried in the plot at the graveyard. There is a lady there that is buried. Her name was Polly Dean, and on her gravestone was this message: "Behold and read as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." That was the saying on Polly Dean's gravestone. Later, many years later, there must have been some young men or young boys that went by that, and they decided they would leave a little poem there too. Their poem said, "To follow you, we were not content, for we know not which way you went." In 1871, a lady named Ruth Wilson left quite a bit of money for the repair and upkeep of the graveyard. Recently, the Historic Commission has been paying a gentleman named Rob Sarabian, and he has been cleaning up and putting back together the gravestones and making them much more legible so that people will be able to read them and enjoy, if you can enjoy, going through the old burial grounds. The next house I'd like to talk about, Hens and Chickens Tavern. It is the John Wynn House, and it's at 13 Wyman and Wynn Street. Now, Edward Wynn had first come from Britain in 1640, and he had his wife with him and his 3 children. 1 year later, after they had arrived in 1640, a year later in 1641, Mr. Wynn and his wife had a son, and they named him Increase, and he was Woburn's first recorded child to be born there. Later on, a larger house was built on this site, and even at the time of the colonies, it became a tavern, and the tavern was called Hens and Chickens Tavern. It was owned and run by a soldier who was a Wynn. His name was Lieutenant Joseph Wynn. Now, as far as the name Hens and Chickens Tavern, a lot of people would wonder, how did that tavern and that house get that name? Well, the Wynns had a lovely seal in their name, and the seal had eagles in it. So they hired an artist to make a sign for the house, and it would say Wynn, and it would have the pictures carved and also painted of the eagles. However, this artist drew the best that he could, and when he was finished, when people saw it, they thought that the pictures were of hens and chickens, not eagles. And so the folks from town began to call it the Hens and Chickens Tavern. And it's such a special house that it's on Burlington's Heritage Trail. It's still referred to as the Hens and Chickens Tavern. The next house I would like to talk about is the Deacon Edward Foster house, located at 3 Winona Road. He owned 49 acres, and it was off of County Road. And Deacon Edward Foster had a Mr. William Lawrence, who was a carpenter and a cabinet maker, build the home. He did do this in about 1825, but it's also known that the house was definitely believed to have been much older before he extended it. There is a folklore that Minutemen were believed to have stopped at this house for cold water drink on April 19th, 1775. An important fact about the house later is in 1900 it was struck by lightning. Now, this did have a problem with the bedrooms that were upstairs. They were damaged, but luckily the whole house did not catch fire. Many owners have since owned this house. Later, there was a family known as the Bruce family, and the mother was Olive Bruce. I personally knew her, and she took wonderful care of this house. I just wanted to mention that. The house looks wonderful. She did a great job. The Grandview Farm. Abner Marion was born in 1800. By about 1834, Abner Marion had met Sarah Prescott and decided that they would be married. The two of them had gotten together and said that the house that Abner Marion had, which was right near his cousin's, Trull, was a bit small, and they would like a big family, so they decided that it would be wise for Abner. He purchased his cousin's house, Solomon Trull's house, and joined it to his house. In 1842 to 1850, they ran the stagecoach, and it was a stagecoach stop from Boston into New Hampshire. In 1858, Abner Marion died. In 1870, a gentleman named Charlie McIntyre purchased the land and the farm and ran a very successful dairy farm. In 1908, Charlie McIntyre passed away, and his son Walter took over the running of his house and business. In 1939, Walter deeded the land, Burlington's first high school, right next to the Grandview Farm. It's where the recreation building is now, and that was the first Burlington High School in 1939. In 1979, a family named Rupings purchased the Grandview Farm. I did want to mention here, the name had been changed from the Marion Tavern to the Grandview Farm because Charlie McIntyre believed that the view you could get from Grandview Farm to even see Mount Monadnock and Mount Wachusett, he wanted to change it to show that it had such a grand view. In 2001, there was a three-way land swap, which had never been done before. And so the town took over. Unfortunately, in 2004, we lost the large barn due to insect and mildew and rot, and also the smaller barn. It has been restored, and it looks beautiful. The Grandview Farm is beautiful, and today people can rent it and have functions there that are very lovely in the large barn. I also wanted to mention the blacksmiths. I mentioned Solomon Trull. He was the first blacksmith of record. And he had a blacksmith shop on the very corner of Center Street and Bedford Street. The second popular blacksmith was Richard Alley. Now, he had been hired by Abner Marion because where Abner Marion had the stagecoach stop, he wanted a blacksmith near him so that if the stagecoach arrived and there was a problem with the horses or their shoes, they needed shoes or some type of adjustment, that the blacksmith would be able to help him. The next building I wanted to talk about is the Walker House. The Walker House is right in the center of town. It has a sign on it that says 1780 because that is when it was built. It was built by John Walker. He was only 18 years of age. Obviously, not only did he build it, but his family definitely helped. He also was in this service, and he became a major general who was appointed by President Adams. Another important thing about John, even though the house is so important, was that he encouraged a breakaway from the town of Woburn. He wanted it to become a separate entity. He wanted it to become Burlington, and it was incorporated in 1799. John had two sons, James and John. James ended up going to Harvard. He was educated at Harvard. He became a professor at Harvard and became the president of Harvard in 1853. He was the president from 1853 to 1860 when he resigned due to poor health. Both boys had gone to the Center School, which was then located on the top of Simons Park Hill. James also was the founder of the American Unitarian Church, and he was the editor of the Christian Examiner, so he had a quite extensive and successful life. He was ordained a minister as well in 1818. In 1874, he passed away, and as I had mentioned before, he was the last Burlington person to be buried in the original graveyard. The last topic I'm going to talk about is the town hall. The first town hall was built in 1844. It was built in Simons Park, and it was there for 58 years. It had 3 rooms, and there was a second floor. Unfortunately, it burned down on May 30th, 1902. The second one is in quite a few pictures. It shows a picnic happening after World War I. And then the new town hall is the one that we have now, located right near the fire station. We also have, in addition to that, the building close to it is the annex. I hope you've learned more about Burlington's wonderful history, from our little agricultural community to a very well-known community now. Thank you so much for listening, and keep learning about Burlington history. Thank you so much.